goodness. All right, lots of regulars. All right, welcome to Lunch and Learn. I'm Jennifer Vanette, your outreach coordinator. Happy to see you. A couple of housekeeping notes. As always, there are some refreshments in the back, and please feel free to help yourself. If you need a restroom, there is one just out that back door. Few upcoming speakers will be the next one will be our History After Hours, the evening series. That's on August 17th at 5:30. And we have Dr. Brad Jarvis from SVSU, and he's going to talk about the Saginaw Canal. If you don't know what that means, come and find out. Then our next Lunch and Learn, remember these are always second and fourth Tuesdays, so our next one is August 22nd at noon. And we have Gerardo Gonzalez, who will talk about the history of Saginaw St. Joseph Parish, which is having its 150th anniversary year. So that should be interesting. To welcome Dr. Mitchell Hall from Central Michigan, particularly interested in links between domestic politics and foreign policy issues. He's a popular lecturer at CMU, though he might deny that, but he is, particularly his history of rock and roll class. And he was also my academic advisor, so I am here because of Dr. Hall. So
you don't need extra credit.
I know, I'm just like, so join me in welcoming Dr. Hall.
Thank you, Jennifer. The sound coming through okay? All right. Well, I'd like to talk today about the Vietnam anti-war movement. Most Americans today are at least vaguely aware that there was a war in Vietnam, and probably fewer people are aware of the movement to stop the war in Vietnam. Vietnam was the most unpopular war in the nation's history outside of the Civil War. But the recollections of the movement against the war are, for most people, very vague and oftentimes inaccurate. Many years ago, the U.S. Congress, I don't remember which congressman now, introduced a bill that was being debated that would create a monument to anti-war protesters. Now, this didn't get very far, but during those early debates, one of my local newspaper columnists wrote this about the anti-war movement, describing the typical activist. Quote, "A hairy, filthy, ragged youth with his arm and hand raised in an angry gesture, usually performed with a single raised finger." Now, I'll let your own minds wander to which finger that might be, but this was the columnist characterization of anti-war protesters. Now, certainly, people that looked and behaved in that manner were part of the anti-war movement, but most protesters were different. And so what I'd like to do in a few minutes this afternoon is to take you through an historical look at the anti-war movement. And then I'll save time at the end for any questions or discussion that you might have. First thing I want to talk about is the political composition. Who were people that tended to demonstrate, who tended to protest, who wanted the war not to continue infinitely or indefinitely for a military victory, but simply to stop it and get out? So I'll talk about three primary groups. The first would be liberals, political liberals. Liberals were the largest constituency in the movement, and they were organized into a variety of groups, like the American Friends Service Committee or the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. And liberals tended to be very proud of America's accomplishments. the nation that advanced human rights as much as any other nation in the world. And they were also Cold Warriors. They were suspicious of the behavior of the Soviet Union. They believed, however, that the war in Vietnam was not the right war at the right place at the right time. That Vietnam diverted resources from more important foreign interests and objected to supporting an authoritarian regime in Saigon. The second largest group would be pacifists, and pacifists were divided into different subgroups as well. Pacifists, more than liberals, tended to question America's Cold War policy. And being more international in outlook, they tended to give the United States equal blame for the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Moderate pacifists favored, like liberals, electoral politics, political lobbying, and direct action, legal direct action, as a way to change policy. More radical pacifists believed that Vietnam was a symptom rather than an exception, that it represented a symptom of a flawed foreign outlook. They were more likely to advocate the use of nonviolent civil disobedience. The third group, and the smallest, would be leftists, and leftists were also divided. The old left is what Americans at the time tended to think of, members of the Communist Party or the Socialist Workers' Party. And even though they had a more radical interpretation of events, they wanted to change the political and socioeconomic structure of the country, their attitudes toward demonstrations were quite conservative. If you were at a mass demonstration and you looked around and you had people with really short hair and suits and ties, they were either FBI agents or they were members of the Communist Party. They fought among themselves in bitter sectarian fights as much as they fought against the capitalist parties. We're probably more familiar with the new leftist of the time. These tended to be younger, college-age, or slightly older individuals who rejected both Marxist dogma and capitalist inequalities. And if any group represented the new left, it would have been the Students for a Democratic Society. Now, there were other groups, other political outlooks that were represented in the anti-war movement. There were conservatives that came out of various conservative religious or secular traditions that opposed the war. But for the most part, it was primarily liberals, then a large number of pacifists, and a smaller number of leftists. They tended to argue over a lot of things, but these are the two most important issues. Should we include communists in the movement? Liberals in particular argued no. They had been through a lot of political infighting in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. They distrusted leftists. And they also knew that associating with leftist parties would open them up to criticism from the general population. They would lose credibility if people knew that communists were involved in this activity. So they wanted to exclude communists from mass demonstrations. Pacifists, on the other hand, argued if we're looking to build a mass movement, everyone should be welcome. And in a democratic society, every political viewpoint should at least have the opportunity to present their views. Now, they never ultimately agreed on whether to exclude or include leftists, but just by practice, whoever organized the demonstration, their views predominated. And if you're having an open demonstration, if you're inviting 250,000 people to New York City, if the communists want to come, they're going to be there. And they'll probably have their own signs as well. So this was an issue that was debated, but never decided one way or the other. The second major point of debate within the movement is how do we resolve the war? If we want it to stop, how do we stop it? Liberals and moderate pacifists tended to argue for negotiations. To have the United States representatives and North Vietnamese representatives get together and talk about ways that they might end the fighting and go on with their lives and our lives. Radical pacifists and Marxists argued the United States has no business determining what happens in Vietnam. The Vietnamese need to do that. So our policy should be Americans leave now, and the Vietnamese will resolve that. Again, this wasn't anything that either point of view came to predominate. Both sides argued their points and held to them throughout. But these were two of the debates that kept people from agreeing on everything else. Each individual organization also had their own priorities, and I'll move on and talk about those now. So now I want to talk a little bit about the social composition of the movement. What kinds of people opposed the war? Well, it was all kinds of people. Women opposed the war in large numbers. Many in organizations that focused on what was then called traditional womanhood, that viewed mothers as more nurturing than men, that as the sex that produced children, they had an inherent value of human life that men didn't quite have. Now that's a view that has largely gone aside, but traditional womanhood at the time was built around this idea of woman as mother, woman as nurturer. And so from this perspective, organizations like Women's Strike for Peace produced statements like this, I'm quoting, "As mothers, sisters, sweethearts, wives, we feel it is our moral responsibility to assist these brave young men who refuse to participate in the Vietnam War because they believe it to be immoral, unjust, and brutal." Other women that worked either through organizations or individually took a different tack. As we can see, a younger generation here on the poster on the right, these are the three Baez sisters. Joan Baez, probably the leading folk singer of the era, and her two sisters were also folk musicians. They put together this poster that says, if you can't see from the back, "Girls say yes to boys who say no." A very different approach from the traditional motherhood. That men who say no to the war, women like those kind of men. That proved to be somewhat controversial among feminist groups at the time. The Baez sisters said, "No, it's funny." Religious bodies, religious organizations, religious groups also opposed the war. Generally liberal religious bodies, conservative religious bodies tended to be much more supportive of the war. But either through organizations like the clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam, or individuals such as the person on the right, William Sloane Coffin Jr., who is the Yale University chaplain, they came to oppose the war from religious values. Speaking on the left here, Martin Luther King Jr. Was a person that bridged the links between the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And he, for a time, relied on the group clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam, the largest ecumenical religious group opposed to the war, to give him some context so that he wouldn't be perceived as being within a group of anti-war radicals. He believed that these churchmen, and they were mainly men, would give him greater roots in the religious community. Clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam produced a statement that indicated their motivations. And this said, "A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. Each day, we find allegiance to our nation's policy more difficult to reconcile with allegiance to our God." Students, of course, were a part of the movement. On the left are two of the Tinker siblings who in 1965 attended a national demonstration with their mother and came back determined to say something opposed to the war. They came from a Quaker community. Quakers were among the religious groups that traditionally held pacifist views. And they decided they were going to wear these black armbands to school, just as a silent statement, we want the U.S. to get out of Vietnam. And even before they did this, the idea circulated that a particular group of students was going to do this, and the school board passed a rule saying you can't wear black armbands to school. So they did anyway. They were expelled from school until they decided to take the armbands off, and they went to court. And it went all the way up, took 4 years to get to the Supreme Court, but ultimately in the case of Tinker versus Des Moines, the Supreme Court ruled that as long as the students were not disruptive, they had First Amendment rights to wear this kind of statement to school. On the right, we see a mass demonstration. These are college students, which were probably the single largest age group that attended mass demonstrations. And they were everywhere, either on individual campuses or traveling to New York or Washington or San Francisco, probably to skip history classes. They would go to these demonstrations and take a variety of positions as well. Students for a Democratic Society issued as part of one of their founding documents this statement about war. We feel that the war is immoral at its root, that it's fought alongside a regime with no claim to represent its people, and that it's foreclosing the hope of making America a decent and truly democratic society. African Americans opposed the war in various ways. In the speech from the photograph I gave earlier, Martin Luther King Jr. stated that the promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefields of Vietnam. And since I teach at Central Michigan University, I included this slide in one of my classroom presentations. This is a famous summit of African American athletes that took place. You can, if you can recognize Bill Russell, Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, some of the leading figures in the American sports scene at the time, got together primarily as a means of defending Muhammad Ali's refusal to be inducted into the armed forces. He was acting as a conscientious objector. And I included this photograph because right back here is Walter Beach, who played for the Cleveland Browns, but before that was a star at Central Michigan University. King, in another speech, said that I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. Military veterans. Really, for the first time, we have veterans of a war coming back and protesting the war that they had fought in. And they did this in significant numbers. Probably the most famous of these organizations was Vietnam Veterans Against the War. John Kerry, one of the leaders of that organization, and later Democratic candidate for President of the United States, testified before Congress with these words: "How do you ask a man to be the last man to die in Vietnam? How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake?" And business leaders, although they tended to be more slower to come into opposition to the war and tended to be much more conservative in the types of things that they were willing to say and do, they were also a part of this movement. A group called Business Executives Move for Vietnam Peace, formed in the mid-1960s and continue on continued on through the end of the war. And one of their slogans was, "War is bad for business." So, what this tells us is that people from all areas of society, different occupations, and what have you, they contributed to the anti-war movement. So the movement really reflected the general population. Now if I could switch and talk briefly again about some of the tactics used by the movement. One was education, and one of the first mass efforts was called the teach-ins. The first major teach-in was at the University of Michigan. And this was the spring of 1965, and what it eventually evolved into was holding a series of speeches and seminars and debates and discussions, opening up to the students and to the general community from the end of classes, or most classes, about 5 o'clock one evening until 8 o'clock the next morning, so that it didn't disrupt the general flow of classes. And when they came to that conclusion, the administration said, okay, we'll support that. So you had basically an administration and a faculty and students that used this as an opportunity to learn things. So, for example, an economist might talk about the economy of Southeast Asia and how the war affected it, or a political scientist, or a historian, or a geographer. They would talk about their own expertise of this particular area of the world. And students would learn, students would debate, and through a variety of initiatives, short films, other types of things, went all through the night, people coming and going and coming and going. A few thousand students ended up attending. So education was one of the key ways that anti-war activists went about their business. They were trying to teach people the facts of the war with the assumption that once people knew the facts, they would change their minds. There's another Michigan connection. A.J. Musty, born in the Netherlands, grew up in Grand Rapids, graduated from Hope College, was the single key person in the early years of the anti-war movement. And here he is sitting in the center. He's not your typical young, hairy, filthy demonstrator that the columnist was. He was in his late 60s, I think, when the war began. He grew up in a conservative Christian religious tradition in Grand Rapids, became a political progressive, became a labor leader. He was a minister, then transitioned to a more radical political activist, was on the fringes of the various Marxist debates of the time, and finally reached a point in life where I'm not really sure that this is working. So he was traveling through Europe. His friend said, you need to get away for a while. Had this epiphany in a French cathedral and came back to his religious faith as the core of his political activism. And that's where he was the rest of his life. He was a Christian pacifist. And he died, I think, in 1967. And his death really took away the one key unifying voice, because he could appeal to leftists, he could appeal to labor radicals, he could appeal to pacifists, he could appeal to people of religious faith, he could appeal to liberals. He was the guy that had been through all of those things in his life, and he understood the language of each, and he was a man of incredible personal integrity as well. In addition to education, government leaders eventually became active in trying to end the war. And so we have things such as the Fulbright hearings, where the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, under its chairman, William Fulbright, would bring in people to testify about what was happening in Vietnam and what the needs were and why things were going well or why things were going poorly. Government investigations, government hearings such as this really added a great deal of credibility to the movement. And of course, that's what the movement was trying to do. They weren't going to stop the war. Government leaders would have to stop the war. They would have to make the decisions about bringing people home and negotiating with the opposition. So their ability to influence government leaders was key to achieving their goals. And we see that government leaders then do become active. When most people think about the anti-war movement, they think about these massive demonstrations that took place once or twice a year. Usually in the spring when the weather was good enough, and in the fall before the weather got really bad. And it was also a time when people were more likely to have flexibility to get away. College students at the end of spring when classes end, or early in the fall before classes begin, organizers recognized that student numbers were going to be very valuable to the success of these demonstrations. I'll just mention a few. The Spring Mobilization Committee was one of these large umbrella organizations that did the planning. They trained marshals to help preserve order. They provided toilet facilities for the large numbers. They provided food if that was necessary. If it was an overnight, they found housing for people. They rented buses, train cars, whatever was necessary. Organizing these mass events was no easy thing. But they pulled in April of 1967, and the numbers always fluctuate but depending upon who gives you the numbers. About 200,000 in New York City and 50,000 more in San Francisco. This huge outpouring, the largest anti-war demonstrations ever to that point. And it would be exceeded numerous times after that. Also in the spring of '67, Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech at Riverside was one of the first major statements by an African American leader from the civil rights movement directly targeting the war. He had spoken against the war a couple of years earlier, but most of his colleagues said, you don't want to say anything that's going to turn President Johnson off because he's been such a friend of civil rights legislation. But finally, King couldn't wait any longer, and he gave us this speech at Riverside Church in New York City. And this is where he said, the quote that I mentioned earlier, that the promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefields of Vietnam. So key leaders in other areas of American life started speaking out against the war. Liberals that same year, 1967, a program called Negotiation Now, which was a way of getting people to pay money and sign newspaper ads so that in the New York Times or the Washington Post, Chicago papers, the LA papers, you would see this long list of people who had donated money to pay for the ad so that you could see who was against the war. And some you would recognize. They would be political leaders, they might be famous writers, they might be people connected to the film industry, they could be public academics, they could be religious figures, business leaders. This was a way of just putting names out in front of people. And so they, oh, well, if he or if she's against the war, maybe I should think about what's going on over there. And the other was called Vietnam Summer, which was based on a civil rights activity of a few years earlier, where lots of young people in particular would donate a few weeks or a couple of months of their time and would simply go out into neighborhoods, knock on people's doors, and say, I'm so-and-so, and I'd like to talk to you about the war in Vietnam. And you're familiar with that. You get a lot of doors slammed in your faces, but every once in a while somebody will say, all right, let's talk about the war in Vietnam. And this is a way of simply making human contact with people. Here's why I think the war is wrong. Here's what I think we might do about it. How do you feel about that? Just to open up dialogue. Another way that people opposed the war were people who were being asked to fight the war. The men who were subject to the draft. There was a draft that lasted up through 1973, and they resisted it in a variety of ways. One of the most publicized way was burning a draft card. At the time, it was not illegal to burn your draft card, and it was a very effective, emotional way of showing we oppose the war. I'm burning my draft card because I'm not going to serve in Vietnam. When they started doing this, Congress, of course, said, now this is illegal. You burn your draft card, you could go to jail for 5 years. So the government and the resistance was back and forth. And then we see, again, demonstrations that included draft resistance. There were a variety of draft resistance organizations, each with different views about how they could be effective. Another mass demonstration, perhaps the most famous, came in the fall of 1967, called the March on the Pentagon, because this one focused on the Pentagon, the heartbeat of American military power. And a famous photograph taken from that shows that military police are lined up with their rifles, and one of the demonstrators is putting a flower into the barrel of the rifle. Although it wasn't always peaceful. There were almost 700 people arrested, many of them beaten by federal marshals. Through electoral politics, demonstrators were trying to get people elected to office that opposed the war, because ultimately it's going to be the president or members of Congress who make the decisions that will ultimately end the war. So the 1968 presidential campaigns of Eugene McCarthy, who shocked everybody in the New Hampshire primary, almost defeating Lyndon Johnson, the sitting president. And his near victory there prompted Robert Kennedy to jump into the campaign as well. Kennedy, of course, a much bigger name, a lot more money, a lot more charisma, and an appeal to a broader base of Democrats. These are both Democratic candidates. Kennedy, of course, is assassinated after a huge primary victory in California. McCarthy's campaign, he was a lackluster campaigner, and at the time, most delegates to national conventions were not selected in primaries. They were selected through party leadership, the proverbial smoke-filled rooms. Kennedy may have been able to win the nomination had he lived. McCarthy was not close. And so the Democrats nominate Hubert Humphrey, who was defeated narrowly by the Republican candidate Richard Nixon. And so the war continues. During the Democratic Convention in 1968, very few demonstrators showed up, maybe 10,000, 5,000 local Chicagoans, maybe only 5,000 people from around the country. And official estimates are that 1 out of every 6 demonstrators in Chicago was an undercover police officer. Just to show that some demonstrators had a sense of humor, they nominated as their candidate this pig that they called Pegasus, and they demanded that he receive the same kind of foreign policy briefings that the other candidates received, but that didn't happen either. And then, of course, Chicago is most famous for these violent street confrontations that the government's own report later called a police riot. Not surprisingly, although I was surprised when I first started reading this stuff many years ago, most people thought that the demonstrators deserved everything they got. They didn't see this as a police state type activity. They saw it as young people causing problems, and so of course the police are going to knock some heads. That's still probably the dominant view in the general public, although I find that difficult to swallow myself. The largest and the most accepted by the general public demonstration was the October 1969 moratorium, and it was driven by two young men in their early to mid-20s, David Hawke and Sam Brown. And their idea was for one day a month, starting with October 15, people are going to not do what they normally do. They're going to take off their jobs if they can. They're going to miss classes if they can. They're going to do something, however, during that day to show their opposition to the war. And if the war continues into November, they're going to do 2 days in November. And if the war continues into December, they're going to do 3 days in December, and on and on and on. It's very ambitious. And they thought that the October 1st event would be small, it was going to be campus-focused, and it would build activity so that November would be bigger, December would be bigger, and each month would be larger until the government was finally faced with the situation. We have to get out. But what happened, in fact, was the October event caught fire. And estimates are over 2 million people turned out in local events, because it was locally based, not national, to protest the war. Here you see a candlelight march in Washington, D.C. that was a part of that. Here is a scene from CMU's campus, where crosses were planted in the ground indicating the number of, I think this was Michigan men who had been killed in the war. But each individual community, each individual campus did something or several things to reflect how people in that community felt. The following month, the March Against Death was part of the second moratorium, but also a separate activity. And actually, let me read from this, if you'll permit me. The most prominent aspect of this demonstration was the March Against Death, an approach that fit comfortably with the moratorium's philosophy. The idea for the march came from Stuart Meacham, who had participated in a spring reading of the War Dead. Rather than have a small group of people reading long lists of names, this march paired each person with a single name. We see these demonstrators here carrying a cardboard sign with one name on it. Each of about 45,000 people walked nearly 4 miles in single file from the Arlington National Cemetery across the Potomac River, past the Lincoln Memorial, carrying a lit candle at night and a cardboard sign with the name of a dead American soldier. Buses transported a constant stream of participants to the starting point. Every 3 seconds, a person began their 2.5-hour journey, walked in silence until they reached the White House, paused briefly to speak the name on their card, and proceeded down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol, where they dropped their placards into coffins. From late Thursday night to mid-Saturday morning, a total of 36 hours, the march continued through rain, wind, and cold. 6 drummers providing a solemn rhythmic accompaniment led the marchers. The first name, Donald Droz, hung from the neck of Judy Droz, his young widow. A drum beat accompanied each name dropped into the coffins. Most press coverage of the anti-war movement was not good. Despite some attitudes at the time that the press is buying into all this anti-war stuff, and they're building up the anti-war movement. In fact, most accounts of anti-war demonstrators were negative. This is one of the few exceptions. The spring of 1970 at Kent State University, most of you are probably familiar with the events there, where a demonstration on campus was pushed across the various hillsides and practice academic or athletic fields until troops of the Ohio National Guard turned and fired into the students, killing 4 and wounding 9 others. This, of course, is a famous photograph that appeared in many, many newspapers and many textbooks since then, the death of Jeffrey Miller. Protests followed less than a week later, a mass demonstration in Washington, D.C. Again, following spring, April of 1971, on the heels of the U.S.-supported South Vietnamese invasion of Laos, produced, again, hundreds of thousands of people in the nation's capital. And part of that week-and-a-half demonstration was the May Day effort, which was an actual attempt by about 15,000 demonstrators to shut down the city of Washington by, for example, putting cars in intersections and letting the air out of tires. That didn't work. But another part of it was the incidents that the Vietnam Veterans Against the War conducted. This is John Kerry. I read one of his statements earlier in testifying before Congress. And in probably the most publicized activity, veterans of the war stepped up to a microphone by the Capitol, made a brief statement, and threw some of their medals over the fence that was keeping them out of the Capitol. A very powerful, emotional image of veterans disassociating themselves again with the war that they had fought. And a couple of other things. Daniel Ellsberg was the leaker of the Pentagon Papers, which he helped to prepare a secret history of the war. President Nixon at this point tried to stop publication of the Pentagon Papers, went to the Supreme Court. The court upheld the right of these papers to publish, and it was known as the Pentagon Papers case. Getting information out, again, the secret study of the war, the background of the war that went all the way back to World War II, up to 1967 when it was put together. Another advertising campaign that I actually did some research on, where, again, there was an idea that came from a student who had connections to Madison Avenue advertising agencies, and they put time and effort into this advertising campaign that appeared on billboards, on radio, on television, and on magazine ads. And a couple of the more notable ones are these. This is the takeoff of the World War I induction ad campaign where Uncle Sam says, "I want you for the U.S. Army." Here, Uncle Sam is saying, "I want out." And here is talking about deadlines using headstones, grave headstones. This is the only deadline we have in Vietnam. So an appeal to people in the early 1970s. And at a time when most anti-war activity had faded away, people like Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda, who at that point were married, continued with something called the Indochina Peace Campaign, where they took slideshows and discussions around the country, starting with the Ohio State Fair in Columbus, Ohio, and having meetings with people and talking about the war on a local, face-to-face level again. They continued again throughout the end of the war. I'll come back to this slide in just a moment, but I wanted to give one more example of a local activity that most people don't hear about because it's not a mass demonstration. This took place outside of Fort Lewis, Washington. And again, I'll get through it quicker if I do. One of the summers, 1969, one of the summer's more creative demonstrations took place at Fort Lewis, Washington. Primary organizer Stephanie Kuntz, who is now a professional historian, University of Washington student, planned a mock invasion of the fort using guerrilla theater as a civilian show of support for military anti-war sentiment. Local elements of the CI, Civilian Alliance for Peace, provided most of the activists, and they solicited local television coverage. A group calling itself Free the Army declared war on the United States over several alleged acts of aggression. And on July 13, 50 civilians launched a motley collection of a dozen small boats from the public side of Tacoma's American Lake. They landed on the enlisted men's beach inside Fort Lewis, where most of the invading force distributed handouts notifying soldiers they had been liberated to enjoy the Bill of Rights. Military police blocked further access and took them into custody, but a frogman in long underwear decorated with a peace sign stepped ashore with a small table to conduct negotiations. The military released them after an hour with letters of warning. Kuntz claimed success from her flagship offshore, noting, "We're going to declare this a victory and withdraw all our troops, and we suggest that President Nixon do the same thing in Vietnam." The humorous handouts concluded, "You all know this invasion is a joke, but your constitutional rights are not a joke." Events like this help to overcome the barriers of class, culture, and politics that often divided civilian from GI anti-war activists. So that brings me to the last slide I hear. What did all this mean in the long run? What did all these people and all of this time and all of these different events add up to? Did the anti-war movement end the war? The short answer is no. But they helped to get the country there. First, the anti-war movement represented a very diverse group of people that unified individuals in loose ways. The alliance didn't always act in concert with one another. They had fights, they had arguments, they disagreed. But one thing they did agree on is the war in Vietnam needs to end. Second, the anti-war movement fought uphill all the way. The government, in large, did not support the movement. The public at large did not support the movement. In fact, the anti-war movement was less popular than the war itself. The press did not support the anti-war movement. So they had an uphill battle all the way, fighting against the odds, but they felt that the issue was important enough to put their time and resources, and in some cases, their lives on the line. Third, although the public generally did not support the movement, they eventually accepted most of the message. That we shouldn't be supporting an authoritarian regime, we shouldn't be putting American resources there, that we were disrupting the Vietnamese ability to resolve the issue on their own terms. For all of these reasons and more, the public finally, through public opinion polls, showed that it wanted the war over as well. And finally, did the war stop because of anti-war activity? Not directly, no. But the social conditions and the political pressure applied by the movement did limit certain policy options that President Johnson and especially President Nixon had, and finally made stopping the war possible. So not a direct cause and effect, but without anti-war activity, the war could easily have, and this is all counterfactual, could easily have gone on longer without public restraint. So I would say that the anti-war movement does deserve credit for making the war stoppable. So I'll end there. Do I have, is this a good time to end? Okay. All right.
Anybody have any questions? Really? Okay, Sylvia does. I was going to say.
My husband was drafted at 23 and a half years old before became ineligible at whatever, 24, 25, whatever it was. He was in the war for 3 years, 66 through 69. He was in Vietnam from May of 67 to May of 68, I was home, keeping the home fires going. It's just amazing to me. I was either really stupid at the time or knew there was nothing or felt there was nothing I could personally do about it, which kind of isn't right. But I'm learning so much here today that I had no clue when I was actually living through it at the time. This is unreal.
I have a date in history. August 8, 1974, Nixon resigns. Today. I'm talking about it.
Very good.
Yeah, it's a good one. He said Dan.
When Nixon started to get deep into the Watergate mess, and of course with his resignation, that affected his ability to deal with Congress. And Congress became, I don't want to say courageous because I don't think Congress acted courageously throughout most of this, but Congress was willing to push back and demand its own constitutional rights in helping to create and conduct foreign policy. So by the time Nixon resigned, secret promises that he had made, and it had not been supported by the Congress because they didn't know about it, those were all out the window. And the secret agreements he had made with the North Vietnamese were no longer in play, even if they had ever been.
I just have a comment also. It wasn't until I went to Central Michigan that I realized that Kent State was in the Mid-American Conference. And when I heard about it growing up as a teenager, I thought this was like some Big Ten, Ivy League, huge campus. And to think of it that it was this middle American college where they were shooting, people that could have been my cousins or whatever, that was just, it was enlightening to me as I matured, but I just found that unbelievable that they would do such a thing.
Yeah. That's the first event that I remember personally that made me start thinking politically. I was in junior high or high school at the time and remembered reading about it and thinking, this sounds like murder to me. Why is it so popular? So that's the first political memory that I have.
I do know that Mitch brought some papers that suggest further reading. Those are back on the refreshment table if you're interested in picking that up before you leave. Any more questions? All right. Well,
thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much thank you.